As you can see, I'm dressed up as Cloud Strife. If he was steampunk, but he's not. And neither is Final Fantasy VII for that matter. But first, I gotta try one thing. I've always wanted to try this. Hold on, here we go. How does he do it? It's like sheer badassery or something. So, if Final Fantasy VII isn't steampunk, then what is it? Well, the biggest contentions on the internet are that it's either steampunk or cyberpunk. But what you may not realize is that there are actually several punk and sub-punk genres out there. And it's important to also note that I don't think when the developers of Final Fantasy in general are creating the style and artwork and the world that these people live in, that they're particularly thinking of any punk style. They're just attempting to come up with a style that suits the individual game itself. And we as the viewers and the fans tend to categorize it in a certain punk style. With that said, I'm going to categorize the proper punk style for Final Fantasy VII.
I created a community poll on YouTube a while back asking what punk genre viewers thought Final Fantasy VII was, and I wasn't surprised to see steampunk in first place with 43% of the vote. So why do I think the majority are wrong in this case? Let's take a look at several punk genres and compare them to Final Fantasy VII. For each punk genre I talk about, I'll first state what defines that genre. Then I'll look for examples of that genre in Final Fantasy VII, and I'll explain my evidence. Let's start with steampunk.
First, let's look at what makes steampunk steampunk.
The term steampunk was first used by writer Kevin Jeter in 1987 to describe his and similar authors' Victorian sci-fi style. www.merriam-webster.com says that steampunk is science fiction dealing with the 19th century societies dominated by historical or imagined steam-powered technology. But then if you go to another website like Studio Binder, they have a slightly different definition. Steampunk is a fantasy genre that's defined by a focus on the style of the industrial era mashed up against futuristic technology. In a retroactive sense, steampunk introduced major story props such as automatons and airships. And if you go to literally any website with a definition of steampunk, it will be slightly different from all the other websites. This introduces a problem. Our society has a bit of an identity crisis of what steampunk is exactly. It's not that these definitions are incorrect, they're just incomplete. There are similar issues with all the other genres too, therefore I won't repeat multiple definitions of them in this video. So I've created a list of characteristics that appear in a culmination of definitions and characteristics and are considered hallmarks of steampunk. These characteristics are architecture inspired by the Victorian industrial era of the 1830s to the 1901 era roughly, has retro-futuristic technology involving steam, springs, cogs, and gears, Victorian-inspired clothing, usually augmented with said technology, along with brown or black leather, brass, and copper. Other elements that are noteworthy are that steampunk tends to be a little whimsical and incorporates a lot of fanciful gadgets adorned with springs and cogs. It's also important to note that steampunk doesn't have to take place in the Victorian era. It just has to be inspired by that era. It can be the future of Victorian and steam technology, etc.
So let's take a look at examples from Final Fantasy VII Remake and see if we can find any steampunk elements in there.
Alright, this is not steampunk. This is not steampunk. This is also not steampunk. This is also not steampunk. This is not steampunk either. This is definitely not steampunk. This is not Oh wait, this could absolutely be from that right era. I'll use Crisis Core reunion footage here as we can see Nibelheim in better detail. But there's one thing missing: retrofuturism. Any semblance of retrofuturistic technology could be from a different era altogether. In other words, the technology that we see here doesn't really scream steampunk. Kind of looks a little bit more modern or just It's missing those characteristics. Let's look back at Midgar, starting with industrialism. In FF7 Remake, we see industrial alright, but we can't really say it's Victorian. The industrial aspect is a bit more modern and takes advantage of fossil fuels instead of steam. The housing and other buildings in Midgar are also from a much more modern era. Only when we see some of the oldest structures in Midgar do we get to hint of Victorian, such as Aerith's house or the church. Seventh Heaven is more Wild West inspired, but that building was built to look that way on purpose, as you can learn in the novel Traces of Two Pasts. Outside of Midgar, in the OG, we also see a mix of different eras of buildings, from the more 1900s industrial like Junon to a more colonial era like Nibelheim or even Rocket Town. But even Gungaga has the remnants of a Mako reactor in the distance, so there's a mixture in the OG as well. But there's two big problems: the retro-futuristic technology and fashion. When it comes to the fashion, there's once again no Victorian influence. Look, I'm not spending a lot of time on fashion. There's no hint of steampunk anywhere in it. The NPCs, the heroes, the villains are all more modern. Now, I'm not saying that steampunk can't have rockets or robots or Mako reactors, but they need to have at least some of the hallmarks I listed at the beginning of this segment, and they just don't. So if FF7 isn't steampunk, then what FF game is? I'd say Final Fantasy VI or IX are your best bets for a more steampunk experience in a Final Fantasy game. If you were one of the FF7 fans who thought the game was steampunk, I don't want you to feel discouraged. There's a huge misconception as to what steampunk actually is in our society, partially because it's such a popular term, and that other punk genres are simply not mainstream like steampunk is today. So when most people see a punk-style game, they tend to think, oh, it must be steampunk. But let's move on to our next contender. Now for the second thing I hear all the time, Final Fantasy VII is Cyberpunk. On the community poll, Cyberpunk stands in third place with 18% of the vote. Let's dive into what Cyberpunk really is. The term cyberpunk was first used as the title of a short story by Bruce Bethke, hope I pronounced that right, in 1980, so this term also predates Final Fantasy VII. Once again, the definition varies from website to website. Attempting to nail down what is truly cyberpunk can be difficult, so let's first look at what makes something cyberpunk and then see what elements of cyberpunk we can find in FF7. The era is present day, either as a modern dystopia or near-future dystopia. Yes, that's right. We exist in a pseudo-cyberpunk society today. I mean, the technology that we have rivals some of that we see in cyberpunk-style media. This most often takes place in a large city filled with advanced technology that even the common folk have access to. This doesn't mean that there's equality, though, as the rich still have the more advanced tech and the poor have the tech of last year, so to speak. The technology is usually considered futuristic compared to what we have today. It incorporates cybernetic implants, nanotechnology, and cyberspace. The technology generally borders on science fiction instead of fantasy, as these technologies could potentially exist today or sometime in the future. And cyberpunk is usually associated with social collapse, involving a megacorporation versus low-life troublemakers. That actually sounds familiar. Let's do this once again and see if we can find a cyberpunk element in Final Fantasy VII. Let's see, this is not cyberpunk. This is not cyberpunk either. This is also not cyberpunk. This is not cyberpunk. Wait, now this is cyberpunk. It's the Shinra building. Holy crap, it's the Shinra building. At least the inside. While the outside has a similar aesthetic as the rest of Midgar, the inside definitely has a different feel. It's the only place we see in Midgar and the rest of the world with far more advanced technology than the common folk. Where people have CRT TVs outside of the HQ, inside we see holographic technology and flat-screen TVs. We also see advanced technology in the form of smartphones that seem to be reserved for Shinra elite and employees. To my knowledge, we never see common folks using these, though they do have access to older style phones. Correct me if I'm wrong about this. There is one issue with the Shinra building being cyberpunk, and that's that the original Final Fantasy VII Shinra HQ doesn't look so flashy. While still more advanced, It lacks holographic displays, flat-screen TVs, etc., though what we see in the HQ was pretty advanced looking in 1997. And as the franchise continued on in Crisis Core, then in Remake, the Shinra building continued to get upgraded along with it. But then there's the rest of the world of Gaia. It's completely lacking in anything cyberpunk. Now, the Gold Saucer could be considered an exception, though. God, I cannot wait to see the Gold Saucer in Rebirth. Give me a like if you agree. So if you were looking for a Final Fantasy game that's more cyberpunk than FF7, look no further than Final Fantasy XIII. It has much more of the futuristic tech you're looking for. Hey everyone, if you're still watching at this point, I can't thank you enough. The research, writing, and asset collecting for this video has been a 7-month process, and is actually even longer now that the video is finally produced. And I'd love it if you smash the like button and join us on Discord. Link in the description. Now, onto the cultural aspect of cyberpunk, the oppressive corporation versus the low-life outlaws. Yeah, that's definitely Final Fantasy VII. The Shinra Electric Power Company has a grip on most of the world, acting as the government for the largest cities and ruling many others from afar. Those places they don't control, they can still waltz in with their armed forces with little to no resistance. Shinra is responsible for the dystopia that exists all over Gaia as well. Now, as far as the punk side of Final Fantasy VII goes, I can't say that it's cyberpunk alone. The punks of cyberpunk are supposed to be high-tech and low-life, but the Avalanche members we see really seem to be low-tech and low-life, using their teamwork, passion, and superior fighting skills instead of hacking robots to turn them on their corporate overlords, or sending viruses to shut down their computer networks. Unless you want to count Genesis and Crisis Core for stealing Shinra mechs and science experiments. Other than that, we really only see this aspect when Jesse and Biggs use stolen codes to unlock doors. Not that big of a deal in the cyberpunk scene. Punk is what all punk genres have in common. We play as outlaws or oppressed people in all punk styles, so I can't really say that Cloud and Party are cyberpunk, as just about any genre can have oppressed people versus a powerful corporation. Even steampunk. Though I recognize that each punk genre has prevailing themes and types of arch enemies, it's not outside the realm of possibility.
But now, let's look at the punk that Final Fantasy VII most closely resembles, and that would be diesel punk.
Where does diesel punk fit into the eras of punk? It takes place in the inter-World War period of the 1910s to 40s, has an aesthetic of black and gray metal industrial, incorporates retro-futuristic diesel technology, but doesn't technically have to run on diesel. In other words, it can resemble diesel, but run on Mako or some other made-up fuel source. The society has been affected by war, or the prospect of war looms overhead. Sound familiar? And the fashion is generally a darker color palette than steampunk, switching out whimsical bright metals and leathers for darker, grungier ones. On the community poll, diesel punk took second place with 21% of the voters agreeing with me, so that's actually pretty cool. Let's take a look at FF7 and see where the evidence for this genre exists. This is diesel punk. This is diesel punk. This is definitely diesel punk. This is also diesel punk. Vehicles at the Icicle Inn, diesel punk. We see diesel punk almost everywhere. The influence of the era of diesel punk can be seen all throughout Final Fantasy VII. Shinra's troop vehicles have a very World War II style. We see early war tanks in the scrap, discarded for the retro-futuristic robots we fight in the game. These robots are welded and riveted together with thick metal armor, pistons, and hydraulics instead of gears and springs. We see the giant Mako pipes all throughout the city. Everything is dull and rusty, even above the plate. War plays a vital role in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII as well. While Shinra is a corporation, they are also a militaristic world power, responsible for the previous war with Wutai, constantly having military actions all over the planet. These military actions have an influence on some of our characters as well, and are driving factors behind their actions. Many of our characters have a diesel punk fashion, but it's plain to see that FF7 has a fashion from several different decades. Characters who could be considered diesel punk in fashion are Cloud, Sephiroth, Barret, Cid, and Vincent, amongst others. You can honestly argue a different punk style for any of them, but of all the characters, they seem to be the closest to Dieselpunk. You could argue that characters like Tifa and Rufus are more cyberpunk, and characters like Heidegger are freaking pirates. Seriously, give him an eye patch and a wooden ship and he's set. Anyway, looking at NPCs, most of them have generic clothing, at least in Remake. These characters could range anywhere from the early 1900s to clothing we might wear today. And if you're sitting there thinking, I've got that in my closet, you might be an NPC. Anyway, I think I've given enough evidence to confirm that Final Fantasy VII is primarily Dieselpunk. Now, Dieselpunk does post-date Final Fantasy VII, first appearing in the early 2000s, but if I were to give FF7 a DNA reference, I'd say it's about 75 to 80% Dieselpunk and 20 to 25% other punk genres. At this point, you might be thinking, but Josh, you left some things out. You'd be right about that. Due to the anachronistic nature of the technology that exists in Final Fantasy VII, we've still left some genres out, so I'll brush over them quickly. There's biopunk, which deals with human augmentation and experimentation. Sound familiar? Basically, anything involving Hojo's experimentations could fall into this punk genre. Let's face it, FF7 is a horror game at its core. There's Atom Punk, which deals with the nuclear family and stylings of the 1950s and 60s. The Fallout franchise is a great example of this, and you can see some of that art style in Final Fantasy VII too. While Shinra's ground vehicles are World War II inspired, they also have Black Hawk helicopters flying through the skies and more advanced looking vehicles as well. That lends itself to more of a steampunk style. And I'm sure you at home could think of yet more genres I didn't bring up. So leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Also, if you would like for me to make another video diving deeper into the punk genres of Final Fantasy VII, let me know and I'll try to make some more. Back to you, Steampunk Cloud.
So the next time you're having a conversation or a debate about Final Fantasy VII and the art style comes into play and someone says, oh, it's my favorite steampunk game ever, you can look at them and say with the knowledge that you've gained from this video, actually, it's Dieselpunk. Sort of. I know it's not a Buster Sword, it's the closest thing I've got, okay? I don't have a lot of swords laying around my house. Oh, it worked! It worked. It's hanging on my vest. That's how Cloud does it. I get it.